Hey, we are back. Hello, welcome. Episode 5, Liminal Ontology and Wellness. Um, so we should probably start by unpacking that a little bit. Last time, I think I talked about well-being. Um, Ontology is just the study of being. So I was thinking, the ontology of wellness or something, being well. Um, but I got a little sucked in while I was thinking of this before starting. Um, come on, wellness. This is this is a little bit tedious to talk about wellness, but ontology, whew, that's exciting. So I kind of shifted to wanting to talk about liminal ontology. Liminal just meaning like between phases of ontology. Um, so we're gonna tack on wellness. I think wellness is just part of the package, right? If we understand being and our being, and I'm going to specifically, maybe I should introduce it now, I want to think about three distinct ontologies, right? A sort of an external, a worldly, a physical ontology, an internal, personal, psychological ontology, and then what I think is the um, not anchor, like the hook, which is gonna help us with this, is that the liminal ontology, which is, I think, actually it's more closely related to the self than the inner ontology. I think the inner ontology, much like the outer ontology, the internal versus the external, the internal ontology is actually experienced as somewhat foreign. It's experienced as a world, as a universe, just in the same way the external world is experienced as a universe. So actually the self lies at the nexus between the inner and outer world. So the self sort of exists, part of the self, one dimension of the self exists in the liminal space between the inner and outer. And therefore it has its own liminal ontology that exists within the confines of language. And that's what I think is the interesting thing that I want to talk about. But ultimately, we're going to pretend that the purpose of doing this is itself to, uh, you know, give us tools with which to investigate our own wellness. So that's wellness is kicking around in the background while we dig in the main vein of ontology. So I talked about outer versus inner versus liminal ontology, right? Ontology is the study of being, which, arguably is one of the most important categories, or it may not even be a category. Being is kind of the boundary which contains categories. So being is fundamental to the category itself. I mean, to the capital C category. To what categories are, right? Like what categories are as a conjugation of to be. So in order for anything to be anything else, in order to say anything meaningful of, this is that, for anything to be anything, there has to be an ontology of like what being means. What does it mean to be something? So if at this point your head is starting to spin, I'm going to do my best, but ultimately we're using the most fundamental word in all of English and all of language, being. Like, interestingly, in French, oftentimes being is, they use the verb have, when we might use the word being. So, like, is being as a cognitive construct, the only, whatever, we can set that aside. But being is, the fundamental word which all other words get their meaning from, sort of. So, like, what is being, and is being a meaningful concept in the context of an external world? So one of the things that I'm reminded of is part of certain, maybe Buddhist, but certain meditation practices, is the idea is, to sit still and to stop doing anything. So stop moving, stop, there will be some necessary maintenance of your structure so that your body doesn't collapse. But, maybe you do a meditation laying down. Really, every, not skeletal, but every, intentional muscle in the body is relaxed, you're not moving, and then of course you go internally and you stop thinking and you stop reacting and feeling, and you let everything relax and ease and settle into its natural state. And part of the, I'm just going to say Buddhist, even though I don't know if that's strictly speaking the best word to use here. Part of their what's the word I'm talking about? Part of their understanding of like the universe, I guess you could say ontology, but like the existential nature of the universe is that like you can't separate your being from your doing until you stop doing anything. So it's only when you cease all intentional activity that you become aware of the unintentional activity. Or if we say that being is as opposed to doing, which we can suppose that for now, for this case, but that's something we could, potentially critique or investigate later on. But let's just suppose being and doing are polar opposites. So then you can't understand the fundamental nature of being or of your being if you're also doing things. You're sort of polluting and muddying the water of experience by, doing something. Like from a scientific perspective, your measurement is interfering with the natural course of the system. So there's this idea of, well, my being is everything that happens when I'm not doing. Which I think is a very, that's not the worst approach to the concept of being. But we also have to think about what is being in the external world, right? In some sense, being is the thing that I cannot stop doing, right? So as I go through the world, being is what I cannot turn off. So from an external perspective, you can't, you could make the argument, well, there's no point in thinking about it or talking about it because it's immutable, right? Doing is the thing that you have some control over. You can change what you do and how you do, and, thinking is a kind of doing, and, you can, all those things. But your being, the experience absent of intentionality, absent of doing, is immutable and outside of your control. You can't transform your own being. And I think that's sort of short-sighted. That's not, strictly speaking, true. I think there are definitely psychological, I don't know if psychological is the best word, but there are things which sort of try to convince us of that you are immutable. Like our emotional states often convince us of, they try to convince us of this. Like if you get upset or something, you might even intellectually know, like, this isn't worth getting upset about, or like, I don't want to do anything stupid or something. But you're upset. Your inner anguish is going, no, this is such a big deal. You have to do something, be chaotic, break something, make a fuss. This is so it's like, as an adult, you have to go like, just relax anger. Just relax, whatever this inner part of yourself is that's trying to throw a tantrum, that as an adult you can actually sort of like try to regulate it. And so I think as an extension of that, there is of course a dimension of being which is polar to doing, but there's also a part of a dimension, a portion of being that is entwined in doing, that we do our being, that being is in some way intentional. Actually, I wanted to get back to this later, but maybe we can talk about it now. That there is an attitude of being, or a I don't want to say a tone. I'm thinking like muscle tone of like, there's being is not just, if we were computer programs, if we were sort of like minds without bodies, then I could understand that. But the fact that we are a mind supported or generated out of a body means that there isn't, we can't ever actually stop doing. So being is made out of doing. And we could say, like, from a scientific or biological perspective, being is made out of subconscious doing. So like the doing of my cells are, homeostatically, energetically, they're alive, they're doing, they're pumping, it's a busy day in my cells, even when I'm meditating, even when I'm perfectly still, even when I'm unconscious, even when I'm sedated, whatever. So being is composed of lower levels of doing. And this realization means that, well, if I can in any way communicate with the lower levels of doing, then I can therefore influence my own being, right? So I can do some macroscopic thing. Well, I'm going to, what's a classic, like cold shower or something? Like I'm going to act in such a way that the subduing processes, like the cells in my body, are going to be made cold, and they're going to release, stress hormones, and then they're going to start activating and functioning in a different way. And I think really interestingly is that with enough practice, with enough rehearsal of going through that response mechanism, of inducing a response in your being through the mode of intentional doing. So I take some action, I drink coffee because I want my cells to wake up from the caffeine, or I, open my eyes wide and, rub them, or I stretch, or I do some action that affects my body so that my body will enter into some process which will affect my being, which will then affect my state of mind or my experience. So it's this sort of indirect loop. But there's definitely a case to be made. I mean, certainly this is the goal of meditation, which, I would argue we're all doing at some level. But the idea is like, oh, okay, once I know the sequence, once I've performed the ritual enough, I can sort of close the loop of the ritual. In Japanese, we'd say musubi. We sort of tighten the knot. There's this ritual, this loop. And as we get better and better at triggering and activating this state, we can make the loop smaller and smaller. And the ritual doesn't necessarily need to be an external thing, right? The ritual can just be a thought or a trigger or an inner sort of relationship in which you allow, or you maybe not even allow, but you sort of prompt or trigger this change of being, more or less just through intentional thought. Even better is subconsciously. So, you're an expert in something, you train something, whatever. You have some expanded sense of self in some domain, and then some impetus happens, some trigger happens, and you're already automatically in process with it, changing your being appropriately. So, like, what you're a hunter or something walking through the forest, and you hear a little, just a faint twitter off far away, and suddenly all the subconscious parts of your brain go, oh, there might be a thing for me to, focus on. So your whole body, whatever, relaxes, it tenses, it focuses, your eyes, your ears, there's like hyperpolarization, you become more sensitive, you become attuned. So your body is going, oh, now might be an appropriate time for this state that I've practiced and know how to enter. So I'm just going to enter it now because it's the appropriate time. I don't need there to be, as a martial artist, I don't need there to be, someone punching me in the face in order to get into a sort of a ready state. The moment something, passes some threshold of, I don't know about that, I'm immediately, internally in a ready state. And the moment that something physically raises that physical threshold, suddenly I start deciding where I'm going to be and, what's going to happen. And, I think like you're walking along, having a nice day, and maybe there's some rocks you walk over, and as you're walking over them, you slip slightly, and your whole body, suddenly tenses and reacts. Because it was just totally, left, right, walking, bouncing, no big deal. And then suddenly there was I might be about to fall. And your body just instantly and automatically transitions into, panic mode or whatever. Or, if you're a little more practiced or experienced, maybe you have some intentional, experienced thing that you do when that state is triggered. But, everybody has a default panic state. We're getting out there. So being in the world, in the external world, is only artificially distinguishable from doing. Being is a higher emergence of doing, which means that they, interrelate. You can't be doing without being, and you can't be being without doing. So I think part of the distinguishing between being and doing is the identification of self. Right? Self is defined by being in a way that the self can't just directly be. The self accesses being through doing. Okay, Julian, focus. Let's talk a little bit about... originally I was thinking having a very clear delineation between external ontology and internal ontology, but I've inadvertently talked myself into they are the same thing. So I guess now I need a new tack. So inner ontology, inner being, I think is maybe more what we think about when we think about, well, at least for me, it's more what I think about, is like, what is the relationship to self? What is thinking like? What do feelings, how are they apprehended by the self? What is the access you have to yourself? As opposed to, the subconscious, which is a part of your being at some level, but is not a part of your experienced being. It might, the tip of the iceberg might poke its head into experienced being. But there are, there's this distinction between conscious and unconscious being. And to me, when I talk about inner ontology, I think about the experience of inner being. And when we're talking about, if the purpose of this fiasco is to talk about wellness, then your inner sense of being, how you feel internally in yourself and in relation to the world and in relation to others and in relation to your life, that's what wellness is. Wellness is this particular kind of ontology. The fact that ontology is sort of a, what's the word? Not voracious, but it's a sort of all-consuming, all-encompassing category, I think is part of accessing the kind of ontological inner wellness that we want. We have to understand the category of ontology writ large if we want to have full access to the tools to access wellness. But wellness itself is, I think, very clearly delineated by the internal experience. It is whatever your internal experience is. Even if something is internal, if you're not experiencing it, it's not directly, obviously, indirectly, of course it is, but directly it's not related to your experience of wellness. And in the same way, the external world is not directly, obviously, these things are very important in an indirect sense, even though the indirect sense may be very immediate. It may be just one layer of, processing and perception between you and the outside world. But your inner state has some sort of conceptual boundary of just what your experience is right now at this moment, how you feel right now. So what is liminal ontology, and how does it relate to the inner and external ontology? Because I think it'd be pretty easy to say, like, there's inner and outer worlds. There's the self, there's the world. Why should there necessarily be a liminal ontology? What does it do? What's the purpose? And why do I like it? Why might I think it's important? And the answer is, I actually think that the inner and the external ontologies that I've been, balancing, comparing, talking about until now, are alinguistic. They exist outside of language. they cannot, in the direct sense of being, they cannot exist in any sort of sense that is linguistic. Um, being is being. The world is the world. Things are what they are. There's no sense in which they're beholden to language. Language might try to approximate being. It might try to approximate reality. But reality is preeminent to language. So maybe externally that's sort of easy to accept, but also internally that a feeling is a feeling. You can think what you want about a feeling, you can talk, you can try to linguistically interact with it, and you may find some success, but ultimately feelings, perceptions, mental activity, maybe with the exception of, and this is a difficult point that I'm going to try to be clear about, accepting the mental activity that is linguistic, because you have linguistic mental activity, but all the other mental activity is alinguistic. Now we have this interesting property that it can communicate with the linguistic part, and so therefore it can access language. But inner ontology is alinguistic by my definition. Now, here's the tricky part. Here's where things get messy. We might want to imagine cartoonishly external ontology as being the world, and internal ontology as being everything inside the skull. But actually, unfortunately, because of how I've set this up, within the skull, the liminal and inner ontology both exist sort of within the skull in some sense. So we now have to subdivide the linguistic self, the linguistic part of the brain, and the non-linguistic part of the brain. So inner ontology, as I'm using it, is the non-linguistic part of the brain. The linguistic part of the brain is, these aren't strict definitions, but is more associated with the liminal ontology. And then, the external world has an external ontology. So when I say the liminal ontology is between the dimensions of the internal and the external, or what did I say? The internal and the outternal was on, I think, the episode 2. It exists in between, yes, in a conceptual sense, but it's the nexus, the gateway, the door within the mind that allows the internal and external to communicate. And it does so using, language, using the advent of categories and discrimination, separation of patterns and ideas. So, in some sense, when we talk about external ontology or internal ontology, we're sort of potentially making a sort of a categorical error in which we're imagining that these ontologies can be linguified. They can be apprehended through language. But being, whether it's, we could say objective being in the world or internal states of being, are fundamentally alinguistic. Meaning, when we attempt to categorize them in language, we actually have created our own system, our own universe of ontology, a liminal ontology, a linguistic ontology, which we then use to approximate and try to get a hold on external and internal ontology. Now, the miracle is that for most intents and purposes, for most daily activities, for most functional things that we actually need to do in the world, and, less so, but arguably even within ourselves, we have decent language, because these categories it's like the more time you spend with a meaningful category, the more likely you are to develop meaningful language to access it. But there are certain, categories of ontology, like, I was talking about God and transcendental categories, that there's a divine ontology, which is just so foreign to us. We have very, very poor language. But also, also divine. There's a lot of parts of internal ontology, of being, of thinking, of perceptions, of process, of, inner mental activity, that we also have very, very poor ontology for. We have very simplistic language I should say, I said ontology, but very, very, very unsophisticated liminal ontology, very unsophisticated language. So I actually think that, and maybe this touches a little bit on what we were talking about last episode in terms of artificial intelligence and large language models, which is that we actually, language itself, I don't want to get too sidetracked by this, but there's this idea that language itself is a reservoir of categories about the world, which means the fact that we've chosen to categorize things the way that we have, and therefore invent the words that we have, mean that, for example, a large language model, an artificial intelligence that understands language, basically, is not just understanding some abstract language or some abstract capacity to communicate, but it's actually learning an embodied reservoir of information about categories in the human world that we, interface with. And that, I think, is really important to understand, because language then becomes a sort of an evolved progression. We will get better and better over time as we innovate and become more experienced in using language. We will become better and better at distinguishing ever rarefied categories, including, internal and, supernatural and transcendental and whatever. There are traditions, spiritual traditions, religious, whatever, that, try to do this. They try to make clear categories for things that would otherwise we would consider to be sort of esoteric. And so I think that, when we think about external ontology, when we think about internal ontology, the capacity to think about them at all beyond their per se existence means that we're actually permitting the liminal ontology to intrude on either the internal or external ontology, which, if I don't think I've said it yet this episode, which is an illusory whatever category or dichotomy. Just like, we can sort of imagine that doing is opposed to being, but really they're the same phenomena, just on different scales, right? Being is composed of doing. And I think the same thing is true, in this ontological sense, which is that we can think about internal personal ontology and external worldly ontology, but they are the same thing. The self, you as a being, a biological being made of matter, made of mind, you are not separate from the world. So the internal and the external may be opposed along a certain dimension, but just because they're, potentially diametrically opposed along a particular dimension doesn't mean they're separate. They're still unary. They're still one thing that we are distinguishing some aspect of, that we are, stretching out along a certain aspect. But that's just in order to understand its edges. But that's not to say that the internal and external world are, in actual fact, separate. I mean, I would hope that would be obvious, but I think that's important to say explicitly when we're talking in these categories, is that, this artificial, bubble of selfness that we say things inside of this are me and therefore not objective, or things outside of this are objective and therefore not me, right? That's one of the classical spiritual, epiphanies or realizations, is like, oh, just because something is, I experience it as external, doesn't mean it's not a part of myself. The other is potentially also a part of the self, or can be identified with the self. So anyways, before I get too sidetracked, the liminal ontology, I would argue, is the preeminent ontology. But I think how I make this argument is very critical, because in actual fact, the liminal ontology doesn't exist at all. There's one ontology. There is one being, which manifests to us as internal and external, which we grapple with through the liminal ontology of language. But there's only one being. There's only, one universe. Whatever. I mean, if you define universe as one, the thing that contains everything, then there is only one thing that contains everything, right? That's a transcendental category. So there is one ontology, one being. But we exist in apprehension of that ontology. And we apprehend that ontology through, language. So the liminal ontology, the linguistic ontology, is not preeminent in actual fact in the lived experience of a human. In that sense, I'm not only wrong, but I am, inversely, I'm absolutely, totally backwards. But in the domain of language, in the domain of communication, in our ability to interface with other humans and talk to them about categories, about ontology, about being, the liminal ontology, the categories of language, are preeminent, to interpersonal communication. So to say, being is preeminent to language is true in some sense, and to say that language is preeminent to being is also true in some sense. The question is, in which orientation do you want to hold this concept in mind? Which begs the question, well, what's the purpose? What's the usefulness of this? Because I think in order for us to communicate, in order for you to listen and understand what I'm saying, we have to be operating in the domain of language. And then liminal ontology is preeminent. How magical would it be? I mean, sometimes that's sort of maybe one of the reasons why we fall in love or have sort of intense, intimate relationships is we long so deeply and so fundamentally to connect directly with others, even with the world or with ourselves, without needing to pass through this liminal domain of language, to just have a direct connection, a direct experience of just we're sharing a positive experience maybe, but we're sharing the same experience. Sometimes it's heartbreak, sometimes it's something really, negative, but we are sharing a direct experience as opposed to a linguistically mediated experience. So in some sense, liminal ontology, our ability to categorize and understand and apprehend the world is, one of the most profound human superpowers. But I think it's also, I don't want to say a dirty tool, but it's limited, sure. Maybe its limitedness is the problem, which is that we have this dimension, which I've called the internal ontology, which is so rich and so vast, and we apprehend the external ontology, which is so huge and so complicated, and yet our tool to get a handle on these things, our language, is so, I don't want to say primitive, but it's so thin, it's so simple, it's so tenuous, it's so, especially prosodic language is so really struggles to capture the profundity of life. That's why I think poetry is so sort of magical and mysterious, that we are able to express things that prosodically would be so difficult to express, yet through metaphor and imagery and poetry we actually are able. Now it's not a verifiable communication. It's not something that could be rigorously reproduced, or it's not verifiable, the transmission. Part of it being a poetic transmission is that it's sort of artistically reinterpreted. So it's not as definitive as prosodic communication, but in terms of, in some sense, like the idea of bandwidth sort of breaks down when you're, approximating and sort of paraphrasing or whatever. But the bandwidth of poetic communication versus prosaic communication is, again, what does bandwidth mean in this context? But it's much greater, right? There's a richness to life, there's a richness to experience, there's a richness to the internal and external ontologies, which the liminal ontology is just like, it's just like some little 4-year-old kid with just the basic constructs of language running around in, like, I don't know. I'm imagining like some like techno-punk futuristic, Japan or something, where it's just like everything is foreign. There's just skyscrapers and lights and flat, and everything is just loud and noisy and intrude. And the kid is trying to just make sense of this world of giants, of all these, it's like a New York City. There's just all this stuff going on around, and they're so linguistically impoverished in the ability to think about and describe and know and understand the world around. So I think there's definitely a sort of an existential feeling. I don't know that I would say angst, potentially, if you're actually confronting the issue, but there's just a sense of existential feebleness, childlikeness, where you think, well, I'm linguistically well developed. I understand the world. I'm not like, where am I going with this? I'm not like intellectually impoverished or linguistically impoverished. It's like I have a good command of language. I can think. I can write. I can communicate. I can explain. I can be poetic. I've got a good command of this communication thing, and yet to communicate well about anything serious or important is just so cumbersome. And then even then, like, it's like, I don't know, it's like trying to fit the planet through, like, what are those, like, Play-Doh pasta things where they take the dough and, like, force it through a really narrow opening and it, like, makes a really thin noodle or something. It's like we're taking the entire experience, like, existence, we're taking being, we're taking the fullness of being and trying to shove it into this, mechanism that takes, we could just say, like, a volume, like a 3-dimensional space, and tries to extrude it into a singular linguistic dimension. It's just like there's a sort of a hollowness, or say like a wire. Oh, like there's like a fractalness of it, which definitely needs explaining. So one of the things I was hearing as feedback was that I was talking about things without, like, just assuming that people know what they are without explaining them. So I should probably do that. I think fractals are usually thought of as like an iterative geometric process, and it can iterate at ever rarefied scales. But I think one of the early fractals are they Tempowsky squares or something? Minkowski squares? Is that what they're called? Something like that. And it might have even been some, like, ancient Greek dude, but I think there's the triangle. There's the triangle where if you take the triangle and break it down into its 4 inner triangles, right? Each corner has a triangle, and then there's the one inverted triangle in the middle. So you take the middle triangle out of a larger triangle, and then if you're having trouble imagining it, like the points of the vertices of the inner triangle bisect the midpoints of the lines of the outer triangle, and then that inner triangle which you removed, you just now you have a 3 triangles together which make an outer triangle but have this hole in the middle. And then that hole in the middle, you just make a copy of those three triangles. And then there's a hole in the middle of that and a hole in the middle of that. And then each of the outer triangles, you can do the same thing. I think the Topinski square or whatever, I'm trying to remember. I think it's the same thing. You take the middle, so you break a square into 9, a 3x3 grid, and then you take the middle one out. And then of the 8 remaining squares, you take the middle out of those, and then of each of those is subdivided into 9, and you take the middle, right? So you just iterate it. But one of the interesting things about fractal and why I used this is that fractals exist sort of mathematically or geometrically in an interesting category where they have some infinite dimension where they approximate a larger space, but they obviously don't fill it. But if you iterate this, at some point when you ask the question of like, well, what does it mean to fill something? Like I think one of the ways is like you calculate the area. So if the area of a square is like 1, and then you remove 1/9 of it, so now you have an area of 8/9 or something. But then of that, area that you remove, now you remove 1/9. So if you iterate this infinitely, you asymptotically approach, in theory, some limit. But there are some fractals where this is sort of like, there's this idea of fractal dimensionality, whereas like some fractals might actually approximate a whole, meaning they essentially fill the space so completely. Like there are these fractal patterns that are like lines that fill up areas, and you could imagine areas that fill up volumes fractally, so like iteratively. So like you'd have to iterate it an infinite number of times, but it would slowly approximate a full thing. So one of the ways to like categorize and classify different fractals is if the fractal is, let's say, a line and it's filling a plane, then the line has a dimensionality of 1 and the plane has a dimensionality of 2. So this fractal has some interdimensional value. Its dimensionality is between 1 and 2. It has a higher dimension than a line because, in part, it's moving around a plane. It's moving through another dimension, so it can't be one-dimensional. But it also isn't fully two-dimensional because it hasn't actually filled this plane. So it has some fractal dimension. So different fractals, you might say, like, oh, this fractal has a dimension of, 1.3 or 1.72 or something. So I think, potentially maybe this is not everybody's favorite little tangent here. But I think this is also, ontology is fractal in that, well, the way we use our liminal ontology to approximate internal and external ontologies has that same fundamental property of we're trying to approximate a larger space with a lower dimensional tool or brush or something. And so it necessarily has this sort of, I wonder if there's some sort of like mathematical term for this. Gosh, there really should be. But it's this sort of like daunting sort of inadequacy or sort of impossibility. I mean, the miracle is that we have language, we have categories, and they work, and we, navigate the world, and, we've stumbled, really emphasis on the stumbling. We've stumbled through history, we've done some miraculous things, which, with a tool, language, which in some conceptual sense seems totally like impossible. Like, how are you going to capture the world? How are you going to describe the world in sounds? Like, I mean, let alone try to describe it in categories. Then we're going to give those categories sounds so that I can sound you categories, and then my deconstruction of the world and your deconstruction of the world, and then we have models, and like it's pretty magical. It's pretty cool that this like seemingly really difficult problem that we, just as fumbling apes, have stumbled into language. And and in stumbling into language and communication and abstract representation, we pulled ourselves out of history by our own bootstraps. We invented language to presumably be engage in more harmonious relationships with our fellow species, with our community. We were communicating non-verbally with them, like there's danger, there's food, there's whatever, and by abstracting it into language, we superpowered our ability to coordinate and be specific and that kind of stuff. And it seems like, from some cosmic perspective, like inadvertently, we had to invent categories and language in order to do that, and now we have this superpower. But the real superpower of language is that it's able to do anything at all. It's not that, like, language is some ultra powerful superpower. It's this, like, there's this, like, idea of, like, I was big into, like, superhero sort of movies and shows when I was a kid. It was, like, very attractive to think of, like, magic or superpowers existing. But it's like, talking, I have a thought, I encode it into words, I encode the words into sounds, I encode the sounds into muscle movements, I project waves at you in the air, you decode them, the waves into sounds, the sounds into words, the words into meanings, you reconstruct what I mean, and then you respond to me. Like, how is that not magic? How is that not mind reading? It's like, when you think about mind reading, maybe there's some exceptions, right? I'm thinking of Heroes, where Peter Petrelli, who is an empath, he spends some time around... Well, actually, I forget the guy, the cop. He also struggles with his thing. He can't control when he's reading people's minds and stuff. But then Peter does it, and he really has trouble sensing other people's minds and other people's thoughts. It's, like, really overwhelming, which makes sense. Like, true mind reading, like, entering another person's mind, like, what a nightmare. Like, you very easily get lost. It's this whole universe you're stepping into that's potentially completely unlike your own. And then to be able to navigate and focus and, like, pick out a thought or a feeling or something from this, universe background, like, that's a very skilled thing. So, really the skill of mind reading is, like, if we could suddenly access each other's minds, that wouldn't make mind reading any easier. That would make mind reading way harder. Now we have to sort through this haystack. Whereas mind reading is easier without, in some sense, you could say, without the direct access to each other's minds. Because now I have to condense the fullness of my internal ontology into this liminal ontology, which is then much easier for you to access. So, like, the magic of mind reading isn't access to the other person's mind. I mean, that's a cool idea, but the real magic of mind reading is then sorting through this mess of information to get the particular thought or feeling or impression or idea that you are looking for, or, want to influence or something. So, to me, speech, language, communication is magical. It is a superpower. It is sort of inconceivable. It is, like, mathematically, like, it shouldn't be possible to condense ontology, being, reality, the world, into just noises, into this very limited set of categories where we're trying to, make our way through life, to communicate, to, all mediated through this very, I don't know how to say this. It's just, like, it feels like, imagine if every building in the world was made out of Legos. Or, like, I mean, it kind of is, but, like, imagine if, we had just one really simple tool to do everything. It's kind of like, I think it's always cool when somebody has, like, a workshop or something, just like a general workshop, and it's like, they have everything. They have one of every. They have to have every tool. So you're like, well, I want to do this particular thing. They're like, oh yeah, I have got a tool that does just that. Or like my mother, she, I may listen to this, so I should say it in a kinder voice. My mother, who's so cool, she has a kitchen gadget for everything. You do something and she'll say, why are you using a knife for that? You should use my purpose-built, seed depitter thing, which has a special, and I'm like, oh Jesus. But see, me, I'm the opposite. It's like, all I need is a knife, and I can do any task in a kitchen. We're gonna use a very limited set of tools, and it feels like it has that kind of character, where like language is sort of an attempt to sort of universalize a tool, where it's like I'm not gonna necessarily need an appropriate tool for each use case. I'm just gonna use this one tool for everything, and just like as any I think it's kind of foolish and irresponsible, but like I'm lazy in the sense that like if I have some thing I need to open or something I need to pry or twist or whatever, it's like, yeah, I've got a tool that will make this really easy and make sure it doesn't go wrong, but it's like outside in the garage, like it's over there, it's on the other side of the room, whereas I have this pencil right here. I could just shove the tip of this and wedge it in and anchor. And yes, it might damage the pencil and I might damage the packaging or whatever. But just easier to make do with this really inappropriate tool. And that's the feeling I have about language. Is like, I mean, it's a miracle. I'm not trying to say that like it's bad, but it's just so simple and limited, and we use it to do such impossible things. So, I'm excited for the evolution of language. I mean, language is evolving constantly all around us. I think one of the hilarious, interesting things that, is totally unintuitive, at least when I was a kid or whatever, is that, like, when populations separate, so, like, when the English people, came to America and settled in what are now Americans, we came from the same place. We had the same language. English was English. And then we separated. And then over the past couple hundred years, modern, English, modern British, this accent that we think of as a British accent, that's a modern innovation. And the way that, 17 whatever, I'm talking about the year 1700 whatever, the point at separation, whatever that was, that English was much closer to American English. Now, obviously, it's changed and grown a lot too, but there's this idea that if a population splits, that the population that breaks off, that, travels to another country or something, well, their language is going to change a lot. But interestingly, the opposite is true, is that these diasporas, these, exoduses of people, actually tend to preserve the original language very closely. In some sense, I think it's part of their identity. It becomes important for them to preserve their mother culture, their mother tongue. Whereas in the homeland, they have no such feeling of separation from their homeland. So the language in the mainland evolves much more rapidly. It changes much more quickly. So whenever you have these groups that break off, you find that they actually preserve the I don't want to say archaic, but they preserve the old language much more closely, while the mainland tends to continue changing and growing and developing. Did I talk about everything? I want to talk about intention versus extension. Intention is how we relate to the inner ontology. Extension is how we relate to the outer ontology. But I don't know, we're kind of out of time. Let's finish with briefly talking about how does all of this abstract philosophizing about ontology, what does this have to do with wellness? And then maybe we can have ideally, I'll think of a teaser while I'm talking about wellness. So, what is wellness? One of the things I talked about in a past episode was the balancing of, like, if you really have an inner sense of wellness and contentment, that you're much less inclined to be motivated towards some sort of transformational action. So I think we have to be careful about optimizing for wellness, because if I'm trying to feel well all the time, but things are not well in my life, I might be masking and sort of causing some issues. So we can talk about wellness, but I think we need to do so carefully. We shouldn't just take it for granted that wellness is the thing we want to optimize for. Or maybe we need a more sophisticated definition of wellness, or more context for what in particular we mean by that. But if we're talking about sort of inner ontological wellness, the experience of contentment, satisfaction, happiness, meaning, purpose, belonging, actualization, whatever. I think an understanding of ontology and the role of liminal ontology in accessing inner ontology, and the framework of inner ontology and outer ontology being, essentially the same thing, with this sort of, I don't want to say false, but, basically it's like all the things I said were good, and if it's not obvious how to practically utilize this information to experience inner wellness, that's on you. I think I need another person to challenge me so that I can say what I want to say. I mean, it's a universe. It's like a video game. It's like a programming language. It's like you have to familiarize yourself with the structural units, with the elements, with the language, with the rules. Familiarize yourself with the environment, the universe, the hooks and levers, and then you can navigate. Familiarize yourself with all the apparatuses and equipment on your vessel, on your boat, so that you can navigate, so that you can make a choice of something you want, act on that, and see, did it happen? Did I get there? What do I need to correct? So that you can map out, your capacities. I think one of the things that ontology gives us a window into is that our own personal ontologies are very limited, right? They're limited by our own experience. If you grew up in a secular or an atheist household, how would you know about the ontology of the transcendent and of God? Like, that doesn't exist in your universe. And maybe even a little more surprising conceptually is, if you grew up with those categories, it's very difficult for you to conceive of a person existing without those categories. So it's like, I think we're very hermetic. We're very isolated, I think, ontologically, within our own communities, within our own cultures. So the phase space of total ontology is so ineffable, it's so inconceivable, it's so massive, it's so many times larger than the size of the universe, that we live in such a narrow corner, this sort of very, we live in our own little niche of ontology that, makes sense for us. But as part of, sort of actualization, self-actualization in the world, is like the flexibility within your own ontology. It's like you could be a completely different person. And I think most people don't live in a world where they can transform themselves and grow and change and become. I think a lot of people are trapped and I feel stuck. And so to me, a big part of wellness is just like freedom. Are you free within yourself? Are you free within your life? Are you free within the world? Are you an individual? Or are you just bumping around, reacting and responding, feeling trapped, within your own ontology? It's been an hour. No teaser, so who knows what the next episode will bring us, but hopefully this was not as confusing as I fear it was. Give me your feedback, ask your questions, and any feedback will be addressed, maybe not directly, but questions. If you ask a question, you have my word, eventually I will try before I die to answer it. So, reach out. Happy to clarify, happy to answer, happy to address. Until next time.